of this year's summer school and also has worked with CBM Ireland, CBM International and CBM Australia. So I'm going to hand over to Mary now to give her presentation on Article 32 towards inclusive development aid.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. Well, first of all, I'm glad to be sharing this panel with two colleagues who will be speaking after me. So I'm giving the kind of the theory or the science bit or whatever we wanted to call it, and I'll try not to be too boring. And both Michael and Aidan are going to come afterwards and give it from a much more practical perspective, which I think will probably highlight a lot of what I will speak about from a theory kind of legal perspective. As with Maria earlier, I am not an international lawyer either. I managed to do a PhD in law without a law background, so I use law with the small L. So what I'm going to speak about this morning is around Article 32, and looking at it in terms of, I suppose, how it can move development aid to become more inclusive of persons with disabilities. So first slide, Eleanor, yes. And Eleanor's my slide person. So for my talking points today, what I'll briefly introduce is disability and development, the context. Disability and development prior to the CRPD, because I think it's important to point out that the CRPD obviously brings a legal emphasis to disability and development, but for many years UN agencies and bilateral agencies have been focusing on disability and inclusive development to some extent. I'll then give a brief background on Article 32, the development of it. We spoke about it yesterday, and I think Catalina and Rosemary reminded us, I suppose, of the different debates that happened, so I will just briefly touch on them again. I'm going to look at the CRPD text itself and its references to international development, and then I'm going to look at Article 32 and the key concepts within it, particularly around accessibility and inclusion. And then I will look in terms of what the compliance are for states for Article 32. I'll then kind of, I suppose, throw out where we are now, and then some concluding observations, which are by me, by the way, not by the UN. I just realised when I was using that terminology, it's very UN terminology. So, in terms of setting the context, Maria mentioned it earlier, and I'll just lightly mention it again. Disability and development, 15% of the world's population are people with disabilities, and over 1 billion people, making that 1 billion people. And while there isn't any particular, I suppose, concrete data, what we have seen through various different, I suppose, agencies making references that 80% of people with disabilities live in developing countries. In terms of the wider context, we've had the changing legal landscape on disability rights, and the CRPD has moved from a soft law approach to legal obligations of states. And it is the only international human rights instrument to have an article on international cooperation. And this provides a comprehensive normative framework for mainstreaming disability in the development agenda. Like Maria, I use the word mainstreaming, I suppose, sometimes with inverted commas, because I think it's a language we use in development, but also I suppose it has a certain currency, but also it has its limitations. Also, in terms of context, is the growing commitment by bilateral agencies to develop disability inclusive policies, and we have colleagues here from DFAT and DFID who will speak about their policies this afternoon. So I think it's really great to have them here and really great to be able to hear their perspectives. And then lastly, in terms of context, is the recognition in terms of overall mainstream development that goals, as we know, the Millennium Development Goals didn't explicitly include people with disabilities. People with disabilities were left out from the targets and the indicators, and various number of UN resolutions realised this and have, I suppose, put forward that the new framework, the post-2015 framework, or the new Sustainable Development Goals, needs to be inclusive of persons with disabilities. And I think, when I speak about, I suppose, issues in terms of disability and development, we always talk about the gaps. I think what we can talk about in terms of the successful advocacy wins at the moment at international level is that the zero draft of the Sustainable Development Goals has got references to people with disabilities in it. That's a marked improvement from the previous set of goals, but now it's about how that is actually transitions and implemented once the text is finally agreed, because obviously that has to be agreed before. So I suppose that's the context in terms of disability and development. So just in terms of prior to the convention, I mean, the UN had a range of programs and different instruments that would have focused around disability and inclusive development, and not maybe under that name, but much more under the name of international cooperation. So I thought I might just highlight one or two of them. So this is in terms, next slide, sorry, Eleanor, for the prior to the convention. The World Programme of Action was the first to explicitly reference the status of persons with disabilities in developing countries, and also in terms of recognising the particular link between disability and poverty. And I suppose previous to that, all of the instruments would have looked very much, I suppose, from an impairment focus, would have, as Rosemary said yesterday, and wouldn't have necessarily thought about disability in the wider socioeconomic context. So the World Programme of Action kind of looked at kind of the link between disability and poverty. And it suggested a role for international cooperation in technical and economic cooperation between inter-regional assistance and also bilateral assistance. In terms of inter-regional and bilateral assistance, it called for donors to attempt to find ways within their means to deliver on the three areas of focus that were the World Programme of Action. At that stage, they were prevention, rehabilitation and equalisation of opportunities for people with disabilities. And I think it's important to be mindful that these early instruments were, I suppose, reflective of how disability was perceived, mainly within kind of the medical model, and it would have been, I suppose, at that stage reflective of that. But also, it did move towards the equalisation of people with disabilities in terms of equal opportunities. So there was a move away from the medical model to a much broader equal opportunities model. So in terms of implementing the World Programme of Action, there was a series of reports that highlighted the social and economic costs of segregating and excluding persons with disabilities, and the substantial adverse effect it had on the development processes. So even back then, development was an issue, and development was seen as needing to be inclusive of persons with disabilities. Next slide. After the World Programme of Action came the UN Standard Rules, and the UN Standard Rules also had a focus on international cooperation. It looked at Rule 21, which was around technical and economic cooperation, and Rule 22, which looked at international cooperation. So in terms of Rule 21, what that focused at was looking at industrialised and developing countries have the responsibility to cooperate in and take measures for the improvement of the lives of persons with disabilities in developing countries. So it's even interesting in terms of the language that they used back in the 1980s in terms of what we would be using today. And then Rule 22 had a specific focus on international cooperation, and it asked for the UN and specialised agencies to participate in the development of disability policy and also ensure that disability policy becomes part of their own policy development. And I think as Catalina discussed yesterday, that's something which is still happening how many years later. But the UN Standard Rules was looking at how to galvanise that. And it also encouraged states to share standards on education and technical expertise on disability issues, with a view to raising competencies on a wide range of areas. So it was very much around states internationally cooperating together in terms of sharing and learning of experience, and in terms of the different skills that different states would have. Quite similar to what we would see in the EU when different countries share across their competencies on disability inclusion, whether that's in employment or in education or social protection. So that's kind of the background, and I suppose that was where we were before the convention was developed. So just to touch a bit briefly in terms of the next slide should say article on international cooperation. Sorry, I have to highlight this because I don't even turn my head to see, so Eleanor's trying to keep up with me. So we looked at kind of the beginning, and Catalina and Rosemary spoke about this yesterday, and it's interesting that the original working group text of the convention, it did not contain a specific provision on international cooperation. However, at the time of the working group, there was a discussion around the importance of the role of international cooperation in terms of states achieving and people with disabilities achieving equal opportunities. So it was there, but it wasn't named in the original text. And there also was a general consensus that international cooperation had a role to play, but in terms of how that would play out within the convention text was something that was then debated, as we discussed yesterday, for a range of, I suppose, a number of meetings that happened over the years. So just, next slide should say, Article International Cooperation, Some Resistance. So just to kind of highlight, just in, I suppose, a nutshell, why there was resistance to it. First of all, I suppose the argument, as we discussed yesterday, was coming from the EU, and at that stage Ireland had the presidency of the EU, so it was interesting times with the Irish civil servants. So what happened was that there was an argument about a separate article would be departure from the basic framework of previous treaties, and that also international cooperation is not a right of individuals, and it should not be a separate article within the convention. So they were kind of the arguments against it. And there was also the fear that basically if that states would be able to cite the article as an excuse for not implementing the convention. So that was a big concern as well. In terms of the arguments for, and as Catalina spoke yesterday, many of this was coming from the kind of the Global South participants, who were kind of very keen to point out that it wasn't just about financial aid, that international cooperation is much wider. And if we think back there to the World Programme of Action and the UN Standard Rules, there had already been a history of it, so it wasn't anything new that was to be introduced. But the key points in terms of their argument in favour of the Article 32 and international cooperation was that it should not be just understood as financial transfers, that it should be looked at in terms of how to set standards for universal applicability, such as accessibility and universal design, and that in all of its forms it can create conditions for equal opportunities for people with disabilities and improving the lives of people with disabilities. So that was kind of the key arguments for the article. So the convention was adopted in 2006, and what we saw then was a move from the previous soft law, which looked at the instruments like the World Programme of Action and the UN Standard Rules, which were non-binding, to now the legal emphasis in terms of what the convention brought. And it brought, I suppose, it elevated international cooperation then to a legal norm. It also created obligations for donor states to ensure that their overseas aid policy is inclusive of and accessible to women, men, girls and boys with disabilities. And sometimes during my presentations, I will kind of move away from saying persons with disabilities, particularly in a development context, because I think we get very much caught within this kind of homogenous view around disability. So I think there's something about always trying to reflect back that when we're talking about persons with disabilities, we're talking about men, girls, women and boys with disabilities, and I think that's important to highlight. The CRPD also creates obligations of states in receipt of donor funding. So yes, Article 32 talks to donor states in terms of giving funding, but it also talks to the recipient states. And the recipient states, once they ratify the convention, also have their own responsibilities for implementing the convention. International cooperation has a role to play with that, but that is within the context of when their own resources are limited. So states have their own obligations to ratify or to implement the convention. So in terms of the CRPD text and international development, next slide. So the preamble, as Rosemary was saying yesterday, the preamble, when we think it's just a list of adverbs, it sets the context and sets out the rationale and reasoning and the important rationale for the convention, and that references the role of international cooperation in terms of improving the lives of people with disabilities in developing countries. It also has, as we know, the standalone Article 32, which is the first ever standalone article in an international treaty. And also, and I suppose I'll speak about it towards the end in terms of the challenges. The challenge is to make sure that Article 32 does not become siloed just on its own. So within the convention itself, there's articles of direct relevance to international cooperation. And Maria spoke this morning about Article 11. There's also Article 28, which is adequate standard of living and social protection. And there's Article 4, which looks at ensuring that policies by states are reflective of human rights of persons with disabilities. And this is important in terms of donor aid and in terms of funding that donor states are giving to make sure that the funding is to support the rights of people with disabilities as opposed to working against that. And that would have come from, I suppose, the general comment with the International Economic, Social, Cultural Treaty, which looked at the whole role of human rights to make sure that human rights and international cooperation are linked together. Next slide. So, and the other important aspect of Article 4 is in terms of including persons with disabilities in all aspects of design, planning, monitoring and evaluation. And I know colleagues from DFAT will speak later on, but DFAT had gone through a whole process of a consultation for including people with disabilities in the development of their first policy on disability. So they're kind of, I suppose, the direct articles that are relevant, but also it's important to point out that all articles are relevant in the context of international cooperation, and that each of them, could be looked at from a development perspective, and that also they're also reflective of general mainstream development themes. Because one of the issues is that we need to keep this within the context of mainstream development as much as we can, without necessarily always thinking of this through a disability-specific lens. So, Article 32. Just to go a little bit more in depth into this, and I didn't actually put up the article, but you can have a look at it in terms of your own time within the CRPD text. But I just picked, I suppose, key elements of it. So Article 32 asks state parties to ensure that international development programmes are inclusive and accessible to persons with disabilities. And I suppose this is one of, the crucial aspects of Article 32, and one that we all talk to. I think in some senses the other aspects of Article 32 kind of get left behind in terms of technical cooperation and capacity building. So what we really do focus, and what we have focused to date, is with regard to paragraph A, which is looking at making sure international development is inclusive and accessible to persons with disabilities. And I think an important point to make about, I suppose, Article 32 is that it doesn't just see it as the role of donor states, it also sees it in terms of the various different development partners. So whether that's UN agencies, whether that's disability and development organisations, whether that's mainstream development organisations. So it kind of has within its sights all of the various different levels and different partners that would be involved in implementing development. And crucially as well, it also looks at the role of disability organisations, disability representative organisations, and the voices of people with disabilities. So in terms of what it actually looks for, it looks at for inclusive and accessible development, international development. It also calls for the facilitation and support of capacity building. It emphasises the exchange of information, experiences and training programmes, and it highlights the need for cooperation and research in the use of accessible and assistive technologies. So again, kind of going back to the previous history of where international cooperation has been, it remains and keeps that focus in terms of sharing the competencies among states, and not just north-south, this is south-south, south-north. So this it looks at it in three different perspectives. And it also calls for a multifaceted approach to inclusive development that recognises the broad measures to be taken under the guise of international cooperation, along with specific measures to be taken at implementation level through bilateral agencies and different actors within development. So just in terms of, I thought it would be useful to unpack rather than going into all of what the article, I suppose, lays out for us, just looking at the relevant parts for, I suppose, donor agencies and for implementing partners such as disability and development organisations and mainstream development organisations. And that is looking at the key concepts within Article 2 of accessibility and inclusion. So I remember being at the negotiations and listening to NGOs speaking about, the barriers that were faced on the ground in terms of accessibility, where donor funding was being brought into countries and being for building infrastructures, building schools and building clinics, and what was happening was that basically they were not accessible to people with disabilities. Interestingly, I was at one of my technical visits I did in Albania many years ago. I actually remember visiting with a centre that was building for to look at how to, I suppose, formalise the business process in Tirana at that stage. And the building had been built inaccessible, but the donors at that stage had actually realised that and actually had made changes at the last minute to make it accessible. So I think, you know, this was a really crucial area for a lot of the NGOs and a lot of the implementers at the ad hoc negotiations around, look, accessibility is one of the key barriers, and we need to look at how to challenge that. So accessibility then became a big part of the international development programme aspect of Article 32. And, you know, we can look, and I won't go into Article 9 in detail, but Article 9 is there within the CRPD text to have a look at what it means. I mean, we talk about accessibility, we're not just talking about physical access, it is talking about accessibility in its broadest sense, in terms of infrastructural, in terms of communication, in terms of technology. So it's very broad. And all of the key issues that are important development themes at this moment in time, when we hear about, you know, building better cities for people into the future as part of the Sustainable Development Goals. So this is a key, I suppose, a key component of that. The CRPD committee, I don't know if people are aware of the CRPD committee, but the CRPD committee sits over and monitors and receives state reports in terms of how the CRPD is being implemented. And they last year issued a general comment on accessibility. And they gave a very strong reference to the role of international cooperation and accessibility. And I'm just going to, I suppose, cover the key points of it in terms of what they've highlighted. So, first of all, they have, I suppose I'd say, suggested, or they're asking, that all new investments made within the framework of international cooperation should be used to encourage the removal of existing barriers and prevent the creation of new barriers. And they've kind of made a strong statement to say it's unacceptable to use public funds to perpetuate new inequalities. Also, they've made reference to all new objects, infrastructure, facilities, good products and services must be accessible for all persons with disabilities. Next slide there. Sorry, Eleanor, I just realised I'm not saying next slide all the time, so you're probably having a hard time to keep up behind. Also, they've asked that international cooperation should not be used merely to invest just in accessible goods, but also to foster the exchange of know-how and information and good practice in achieving accessibility. And also they have made a comment with regard to the role of international cooperation and the standardisation of accessibility standards, and looking at how that can participate in national and international processes to develop, implement and monitor accessibility standards. So this is a newish comment which has come out, but I think it's very useful, I suppose, from an advocacy perspective, that you're able to refer to that, you know, and also in conversations with donor agencies and different implementing partners about why accessibility is so important, and I think it gives a little bit more extra weight to that. I think it's important to realise that Article 32 is new, I suppose, and it's young in terms of its jurisprudence and what that means in terms of implementation. So I think this general comment really helps frame with regard to accessibility. So just to unpack then the other aspect of inclusion, and I think, you know, this is talking about inclusive development programmes. The OHCHR, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, in 2011 published a report in terms of what Article 32 means and how it can be, basically the report was published on the basis of a number of submissions coming forward from states, from NGOs, from DPOs, about what their view of Article 32 was. So in terms of inclusion, there was kind of three different perspectives that emerged, and these are useful to think, I suppose, in terms of, from a development perspective, how, even from a programming perspective. To ensure that people with disabilities and their representative organisations are not excluded from the various stages of development. And I think, you know, if we look back to, I remember being involved in a project for PRSPs at one stage, which was looking at how to get people with disabilities involved in the national processes, because up until very rarely was there actually the inclusion of people with disabilities. So that was one aspect, was making sure that they're not excluded. But the second one was to take a much, because you can make sure people are not excluded, but also you need to take a much more proactive role to make sure that people are included. So that was the second aspect, where they looked at making sure that, you know, when people with disabilities are included, that it is meaningful consultation. And that people are being brought to the table to give their views, to give their input with a view to it making changes rather than just coming to participate. And then lastly, in terms of inclusion, was looking, and this is a key challenge, and we'll speak about it later today in terms of gender equality and women with disabilities, was to ensure that, when we talk about inclusion in development, we're talking about ensuring that the diversity of disability and people with disabilities is recognised. And this is particularly true on two bases. One is in terms of the different identities that disabled people can have, so whether that's older disabled people, younger disabled people, women with disabilities. But also it's around kind of the different, I was supposed to use the word, impairment types, because the World Health Organization in 2010 published a report to highlight that people with mental health issues were not included in development. So this was a key gap, and in terms of, 5 minutes, I'm one of these people that speaks too fast and I have too much to say. So that was a big issue. And then also, Human Rights Watch have sent published a number of reports now which talk about, how people with psychosocial disabilities, human rights are being hugely violated in many countries. So, in terms of, I might skip the slide there, Eleanor, on elements of compliance required by states, because I think I've just spoken kind of roughly around that, but the slide is there and it's in the presentation, so you can come back to it at your own time. So where are we now? So as I said, the jurisprudence surrounding Article 32 kind of remains in its infancy. But there are, I think we have, because I've read them recently, I think there's about 80, Katia might be able to answer the question, I think there's about 80 state reports that have been submitted so far under the CRPD reporting. And within that, there is, each state is reporting on how they're implementing Article 32. And I suppose one of the key aspects that are coming from it is that a lot of it is disability specific. There are aspects of mainstream, but a lot of it are disability specific. And the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights had already identified this back in 2011 to say, we need to be careful to ensure that development, we are talking about mainstream development, and while disability specific projects are very important, we also need to think about how we can really leverage this to, up to as I said yesterday, up to where the big money is and up to where the big sectoral work is happening. So I think that's kind of where we're at with regard to that at the moment. State reports generally are kind of focusing around kind of the disability specific aspects. So, in terms of concluding observations from the last slide, Eleanor. Okay, so Article 32. I suppose it's got a big job of work to do and lots of expectations with it, and a big area of which it's working in. I think one of the big challenges is how to scale up the efforts for inclusion and accessibility that are happening into the wider work that bilateral agencies and UN agencies are doing. So as Kata spoke yesterday in terms of getting an agency like the UNDP to take on the issue of disability and mainstreaming disability. So it's important that we have our disability specific side, but we also need to look at how we can scale that up to make sure that there's multiplier effects and that we're not keeping it siloed within one specific area. Article 32 must not become siloed within the CRPD, but instead play a role of auditing or disability proofing international development aid. I don't like the words auditing or disability proofing, but just to give you the idea that Article 32 should be playing a check in terms of how donor agencies are implementing their development agency overall, and UN agencies also. And then lastly, I think which is really important in terms of the coming months and the agreement of the final text of the SDGs is that the link between human rights and development that the CRPD makes is continued, and that the CRPD is it's a natural way to implement the overall arching goals of the SDGs. And this is kind of the driving force that many of the disability advocacy organisations are discussing in New York at the moment. So I think what would be really unfortunate to see is that you have separate parallel, you have the SDGs being implemented and the CRPD being implemented. So we need to look at how they cross over each other, because they reinforce each other and support each other. So I think that's from me. Sorry if I cover things too fast. Yeah.
speaker, who is Aidan Levy, and then we'll take questions at the end of the session. So I'm delighted to introduce Aidan from Plan International. Aidan is the inclusion specialist there since May 2011 and has over 15 years of experience in working at grassroots level in development management, including in Honduras and Guatemala. So over to you, Aidan.
Thanks very much, Eleanor. Great to be here, and great to be back in Galway. Great to be in Galway with amazing weather. What have you done? Please stay. Okay, well, I think my presentation follows very well from many of the stipulations included in the Article 32 presentation that we've just heard from Mary, because Plan International is a mainstream NGO, so we are faced with many of the challenges that bilateral agencies and other organisations are faced with when looking at mainstreaming disability in our work. But before I get into my presentation, I'd just love to ask a question. Who has heard of Plan International in the audience, and who knows of Plan International? Perhaps if I could get a show of hands. Okay, so 50-50. That's interesting. So we have more work to do, definitely. Well, listen, just before I get into an overview of how we're looking at mainstreaming disability in our work, just a little bit of information and background around Plan International, I think, to set the scene. Plan is, as I said, it's an international child rights NGO, a mainstream organisation that has a global network, was established initially in 1925, so it's been in operation for a significant amount of time. Currently, we're operating in just over 70 countries. As you can see, our programme countries is where we actually implement programmes on the ground. We're currently operating in 51 countries worldwide. Those operations are supported by a combination of our donor countries. Plan Ireland, for example, would be regarded as a donor or a national office that would both provide funding but also technical support to our country offices. We also have a number of programme and donor countries which combine both. So, for example, Colombia both implements programmes but also raises funding locally to ensure that there's greater sustainability of the work. So overall, a presence in just over 70 countries. And in order to achieve our vision of change, we work with a whole host of different stakeholders. And as you can see in the yellow outside circle, we work with a host of stakeholders at multiple levels, particularly at local level, working very much with those who are closest to and are responsible for children. So parents, teachers, caregivers in the community, the local community structures, then working with other international NGOs such as Save the Children, such as World Vision, Oxfam, etc. We work to a certain degree with the corporate sector, with civil society, UN agencies, and very much so with government. Government at national level and at local level as well. And a host of different approaches that we use to really make sure that our vision is achieved. But what's most important is that we place the child at the centre and that we work with children actively, ensuring that they are not just beneficiaries, but they're active agents of change. And that's really important. It's not easy, and the quality of that work fluctuates from country to country, but it is important that in order for us to reach and support as many children as possible to realise their full potential, we need to make sure that they are at the centre of our work continuously. Okay, so just to give an idea of the areas of intervention, if you will, Plan has, for the last number of years, been working on a series of programme impact areas. These are subject to change. We're currently doing a global strategic review, so we'll have a new global strategy next year. So when people see this diagram or hear of the breadth of our programme impact areas, they're wondering how is it possible to have such a breadth of coverage. But since we are operating at local level with so many communities, there are many needs that need to be met, and there's a demand from communities to work on a whole host of areas. So currently we're focusing on 8 programme impact areas. Firstly, the area of education. Traditionally, there was a focus very much on access to education. Thankfully, there's been a move towards a greater focus on quality education, which is important, and more recently, a greater focus on inclusive education. The second area is health. Third is emergencies, both preparedness and response. Child participation, which really cross-cuts across all of our work, as does child protection. Economic security, ensuring that parents have the means and the wherewithal, and even adolescents, to provide for children is very, very important. Sexual and reproductive rights is another area of focus. And finally, water and sanitation. So they're the 8 programme areas that guide the work both internationally and at local level through our country offices. So this is a horrible slide, my apologies, before I get into it. But I think it helps set the scene of the breadth of coverage. Where this is from 2014. So if you look at the blue section, we have a global income last year of just over 700 million euros. What's important there, though, is not necessarily the figure. What's more important is actually the breakdown of it. Just below, we see a split of our income. We have just over 350 million from sponsorship income, and 232 million from grants. So the sponsorship comes from a total support of 1.5 million individual sponsors that support our work at country level. So they support 1.4 million children with children in the communities that we work in. And the average amount of time that a sponsor sponsors a child is 18 years. So that provides us with a certain longevity when we want to work with communities and ensure that we have lasting change so that children can access their rights. So that's important. And currently we're working with just over 8,500 staff across the 50 or 51 programme countries. And also just below on the right-hand side, in terms of partnerships, at the moment we have 3,878 partnerships with national and local governments. So very much working closely with local authorities in countries to ensure that they are supported, to ensure that the rights of children are included in, as Mary mentioned earlier on, that previously there was a lot of work with the Poverty Reduction Strategy Papers, the PRSPs. So the work with national and local governments is really important in that, and that's an area of huge engagement for Plan. So moving on, where does disability inclusion fit into this? Well, as a mainstream organisation, we have a focus on inclusion in the broadest sense, and we would see disability as being one component of that. So that's a huge challenge, but what we essentially want to ensure, and this is what we're currently developing, a tackling exclusion framework in order for us to be inclusive and to do good quality inclusive programmes. We need to understand, first of all, the root causes of exclusion, why people are discriminated against, what are the root causes, whether it's in communities or at national level. So hence the current move to define and confirm this year a tackling exclusion framework, which really looks at tackling the root causes and the consequences of exclusion. So Plan has defined 3 core areas that we want to work on to ensure that we can support the rights of children with disabilities, of stateless children. For example, many children, you look at Liberia, for example, 5% of children under the age of 5 have a birth certificate. Like, that's a horrendous statistic that leads to a huge amount of potential violations of their rights. So it's an area that Plan has worked a lot in to make sure that children have access to the very basic right of identity. Without that right, they are subject to greater exclusion. Another area that we're increasingly working on is the area of sexual orientation, ensuring that lesbians, gays, transsexuals, intersex have the possibility to ensure that they are protected from violations and from discrimination. So we need to have an intersectional approach. I'm sure that's been discussed this week in the school, the challenges of ensuring an intersectional approach. And we need to include that in inclusive programs and interventions at local level, but also in our policy, advocacy and campaigns and our communication work. That's the second priority pillar that we've defined. And the third area is inclusive workplaces. We want to make sure that we walk the talk, that as an organisation we ensure that we foster inclusion in the workplace, that we embrace diversity, that we respect diversity. And there's many examples of where that's actually happening already. But it's a long road, and with over 8,500 staff, we have a long way to go. But I think it's important to commit to it and clearly articulate that in this framework. Across all of these three priority pillars, it's important to ensure that we embed certain standards. And we have what are known as another acronym, the CCCD standards, which stands for the Child-Centred Community Development Standards. And one of those standards is a standard on tackling exclusion and gender inequality. So we really feel that the work on inclusion needs to be very closely aligned to gender equality. They are very different, but they are very inextricably linked. So it's important to ensure that gender equality is very closely integrated with our work on inclusion. Learning is important that it is throughout all of these three areas that we provide the opportunities, not just for Plan staff, but also for partners. And increasingly over the last 3 to 4 years, we've seen a lot more engagement by Plan colleagues with DPOs at local level, but also internationally. We're working very closely with the International Disability and Development Consortium, the IDDC. Enablers. I'll speak more in a moment about some of the research that we've done. We feel that it's important to increasingly place a focus on using an evidence base to inform good quality programming and to manage that knowledge, which is not always that easy, but it's important to have clear standards in place to manage the knowledge and ensure access to continuous professional development for staff. And partnerships. Partnership is a very important enabler for Plan, but good quality partnerships. So there isn't what there has been in the past, for example, almost a focus on service delivery. So we want to move away from that type of partnership and have a more holistic partnership in place. Okay, so as I mentioned, ensuring an evidence base for programming is important. It's not Plan's forte to do research, so it's a relatively new area of work for us as an NGO. And I think, thankfully, over the last 2 years, particularly 2 to 3 years, there's been an increasing recognition of the need to ensure that our work with children with disabilities is supported by an evidence base. So, for example, there's 3 examples I'm going to just briefly outline. And the first one is an analysis we did of our sponsorship data. As I mentioned, we have 1.5 million children that are supported through our programs. So we wanted to break that down a little bit and understand, well, how many children with disabilities are there, in fact, in that data set? And unfortunately, we found a horrific statistic that only 1% of those children are children with disabilities. So for us, that was a wake-up call to say, well, actually, we need to do more to ensure that we're reaching out through our colleagues at community level and ensuring that children with disabilities who have been traditionally invisibilised and excluded really have the access to our health programmes, to the education programmes that we're working on. So we felt it was important to do this global survey. Of the 51 countries, we analysed data from 30 countries. And if you look on the right-hand side of the screen, what we found was quite striking, that children with disabilities are often 10 times less likely to go to school than children without disabilities. So again, it was another wake-up call for us as an organisation to try and make a shift towards ensuring that our education programmes are accessible and truly accessible to children with disabilities. We also find that children with disabilities often fall behind their peers, that even when they do attend school, perhaps the infrastructure, the systems are not in place to ensure that true learning really does happen. And I just want to give a statistic of an initiative that is separate to this, but Plan Ireland did some research in West Africa, and they took a longevity sort of approach over 4 years and found that children who were attending primary school for a 4-year period in West Africa, particularly Sierra Leone, Liberia, Guinea and Guinea-Bissau, could not even write one full sentence after being in school for 4 years. So, there's a huge difference between access and quality education, and for us, one of the main learnings from this research is we really need to ensure that teacher training, good quality teacher training with a very strong pedagogical approach is important and needs to be embedded in our programming. We also find that children with disabilities are often more likely to have had a serious illness than children with disabilities, and that was for a host of reasons. One, of lack of access to services. Secondly, because of the stigma that's associated, perhaps their parents or their caregivers would not bring them to a health centre. So there's a host of reasons behind that. But again, something that was a wake-up call for us to really try and improve the situation through our programmes. A second piece of research that we conducted just over 2 years ago was in West Africa. And again, it was in a number of those countries that I mentioned, in Sierra Leone, Niger, Guinea and Guinea-Bissau. So 4 countries, we really wanted to focus on what are the true situations with regard to access to education and to child protection. And the main finding was, after having conducted over 280 interviews with children with disabilities, with parents, with teachers, village chiefs, etc., was that community perceptions and customary laws were the source of endemic violence and discrimination against boys and girls in communities. That violence against girls with disabilities is mostly happening at home, that oftentimes the perpetrators of violence and discrimination were those who were closest to children, which is very, very difficult to address and has enormous connotations for the way in which we work. Also, that boys and girls are highly exposed to various forms of violence, but the stigma for girls is often heavier because of the value that's attributed to them, the lesser value that is attributed to them, but also because of the power that is exercised over them because of that value. So these are, some of the main findings. I can send a link around to the full report. I think some of the main recommendations very much resonate with what Mary said earlier on about the key areas of the Article 32 of the Convention, with ensure that there's awareness raising, capacity building and a multifaceted approach. So they were some of the key recommendations that came out of this piece of research. Time, okay, just fly through these. We did a recent survey on staff, and we had 35 country offices, so we've seen an increasing amount of staff who have a role to play, an official legitimate role on disability inclusion, so currently 31%. I won't go through, I think just 2 last slides and then I'll wrap up. But some of the challenges that we're facing as an organisation: translating an exclusion analysis, a good quality exclusion analysis and an intersectional approach into our planning and our programme design is an increasingly important challenge that we need to address. Moving from programmes that address just excluded groups to a more mainstreaming approach. So really applying a twin track approach and embodying the learning between the two tracks is important. A lack of clarity on how far Plan is prepared to go in its commitments to tackling exclusion. I won't get into that just now for time reasons. A need for enhanced staff and organisational capacity. Very, very important to build our capacity as an organisation. A need for stronger and better quality partnerships to ensure that we can actually have complementarity. We're never going to become a disability-specific organisation, but we can work in a complementary manner to ensure that we can improve the quality of our programmes, but also have greater reach. And then just finally, not to end on a negative note, some of the promising developments that we've seen, we have a set of organisational standards on tackling exclusion and gender equality. We've greater integration of inclusion criteria in gender equality processes. We have a learning academy, which is an important asset for staff that they can access. We've a number of specific interventions, community-based rehabilitation work in West Africa, inclusive water and sanitation work in Indonesia, and we also have a number of mainstreaming initiatives that we can learn from and build on, particularly work that we're doing in Asia on inclusive education in Bangladesh and Nepal. Some research. We have a disability inclusion working group which is re-energised, which is important that it's a focal point that people can go to when they need support. And we also have the Tackling Exclusion Framework, which are currently developing, which hopefully will set the scene and the tone for future work and ensure that we get organisational commitment from senior management, which is very important in this battle for inclusion. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aidan, and apologies for cutting you off for time. I'm sure you have more examples that you can discuss, and hopefully people will have questions for you. So now I'd like to introduce our last speaker in this session, Michael Schwartz, who is a lawyer and associate professor of law and directs the Disability Rights Clinic in Syracuse University College of Law and has done since 2004. Michael is currently a Fulbright scholar, and he's working at Queen's University Belfast in Northern Ireland. And he is focusing in his study on the experiences of deaf patients in the healthcare field, with a particular focus on mental health services. So Michael is going to present for us now some of his work in the development context with deaf people. So over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Eleanor. Hello, everyone. I'm going to be using American Sign Language for my presentation, and my voiceover will be done by Patricia. So I come to you today wearing 3 hats. First, I was born deaf, so I'm a native insider, and I have lived experiences of discrimination. For example, I remember Harvard University. I went to an interview to get in as a student. I went to apply for an undergraduate admission. And the interviewer said, "You're deaf. What makes you think you can succeed in Harvard?" So fast forward, 135 law firms. I applied. I was an attorney. I had a lot of experience, had a few degrees. So I applied to 135 law firms. And in my cover letter, my application, I said I was deaf, but I can speak and read lips. I received 135 rejections. So I grew up without captioning. There was nothing, I wasn't having captioning TV or movies, airlines. So I've experienced a lot of discrimination, the brunt of discrimination, being deaf. So my second hat is I'm a lawyer of 33 years. I've had litigation experience, and oy vey. And I'm a sociologist. That's my third hat. I'm a sociologist. I have a PhD in disability studies from the Education Department in Syracuse University Disability Studies program. And my dissertation, I focused on deaf patients in the medical setting, how they communicated or didn't communicate with their doctors or healthcare providers. And these last 6 months, I've been a researcher under the Fulbright grant at Queen's University in Belfast. So I've been looking at the communication between deaf patients, health providers, and sign language interpreters. And this time, I'm interviewing all three stakeholders. So I've done about maybe 65 interviews. And I have a lot of transcripts, data to go through. And I've gathered some insights into how these three communicate with each other, or don't communicate with each other. And I found, for example, that the National Health Service pays for interpreters. That actually removes the incentive to discriminate. Whereas in America, we have the Americans with Disabilities Act, but it's an unfunded mandate. There's no funding for the doctors to provide interpreters. So they have to do it themselves, and it's an incentive then to discriminate. So some of the problems that I've found in Northern Ireland are insufficient mental health services for adults, and none for deaf children. Emergency care, that's another problem. So a deaf person who goes into A&E, as it's referred to, accident and emergency room, good luck trying to find an interpreter, really. Most of the times they don't. And a side discovery that really wasn't, I didn't intend to look for it in any way, but it came out that there were many people who said that solicitors are not accessible to deaf people. They refuse to provide interpreters. So it seems to me that that's a violation of access to justice. And remember, Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom, so they are signatories of the convention. And that's not just solicitors. It's also what I call the FIRE areas. So it's finance, insurance, and real estate. Those professionals and those entities are not accessible. They're not communication accessible to deaf people. None of them. So what I was told repeatedly, over and over again, was that funding is the big problem. There's no funding for interpreters and for effective communication access. So instead, what they were saying was, they were being told that the Disability Discrimination Act was the law in the United Kingdom, in Northern Ireland, and they have what's called reasonable adjustments. And doctors often said, well, you know, it's a reasonable adjustment if we write back and forth. Really? What are you talking about? Seriously? You know, if you have a mental condition, let's say, or a serious mental health issue, and a deaf person may have language that's different. They have using sign language as their first language. A reasonable adjustment is not to hand them paper and pen. That doesn't fly. So I will be writing a report on my findings, and I'll make that available as well when it's ready. So currently I'm a director and supervising attorney at Disability Rights Clinic at Syracuse University. And in the clinic, I have 10 hearing law students who come into the clinic in August, and they leave in May of the year. So when they come in August, they're terrified. They're scared to death. And the reason for that is because I'm a deaf professor. And I'm out there lecturing and using sign, and they're like, what? And they're really very nervous. But I reassure them, and by the time they leave in May, it's like, no big, no problem. They're very comfortable. And not just with deaf people, but also with people with disabilities. And we do everything from integrated advocacy, which means anything from writing a letter, giving a talk, doing consciousness raising, all the way to litigation. We do employment discrimination, access to government service, and access to places of, businesses open to the public. We work with prisoners as well, prisoners with disabilities, and also children with, quote-unquote, special needs. But don't we all have special needs? I mean, I don't understand why they use that term, special needs. Anyway. So a few things that I've learned over the last 25 years, since the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed and has been law in the States. Number one, law cannot guarantee what a culture is not willing to give. I'm going to say that again. Law cannot guarantee what a culture is not willing to give. And what I mean by that, yeah, actually, I wish I could, but I can't take credit for that quote. That was Mary Johnson, and in her book, which I don't remember off the top of my head, but Mary Johnson said that. It's a great quote. What I mean by that is that litigation is time-consuming, very expensive, and with an uncertain outcome. So what we have to do, in addition to litigation, is we actually have to work on changing the culture, changing the mind and hearts of people. Easier said than done. Integrated advocacy, and I'd like to define that as collecting qualitative data, qualitative research methods, where you gather narrative and data through interviewing people with disabilities, their insights, their understandings and experience, and use that data to give weight to the policy arguments. And this isn't a surprise to me, but lawyers and judges in America are some of the worst offenders of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Really? Judges don't get it. When it comes to communication access and working out the logistics of communication, for example, in court, like say a divorce court, family law court, right? So take the example of both parties being deaf. They'll arrange for just one interpreter. And each of the parties, opposing parties, are deaf. So then you may need a certified deaf interpreter. It just is complex. And logistically, you need to work together to have things work out for access for deaf people. Very often the court system doesn't have any training. And I offer trainings that I did a few years ago, the State Judges Convention. There were 600 judges. Guess how many came to my workshop? Just two. Just two. So, now, let me talk to you about my international work a little bit. Hopefully that will highlight some of the successes of international cooperation. Okay. For example, Vietnam. I visited Vietnam 3 times. First was to adopt our baby girl. She was 3 months old. We brought her home. The second time I went back when she was 13, And then just this past December for a different trip. So in the December 2012 visit, 2012, we visited a restaurant called the Bread of Life Center. It was in Da Nang. And it was run by and hosted and cooked by and served by deaf people. All the employees were deaf. They did the cooking, they were the waiters, the maitre d', the whole thing. And it was an awesome experience. Hearing people would come in and they would take the menu and they would have to point to whatever they wanted. And if they didn't understand, if it wasn't clear, they wrote it down. And deaf people would come in, no problem, signing away, fully accessible. The service was a little slow because the waiters were chatting away with people and spending more time with orders, but it didn't matter. It was fantastic. So if you're ever in Da Nang, in Vietnam, go to Bread of Life Cafe. Fantastic. So in December of 2014, I was lucky enough to be able to take a group from Syracuse University, a group of students, 2 of whom joined us from California State University Northridge, the Deaf Studies program. So there were two deaf students. And so the group was mixed. There were some social work students, School of Education, College of Law, counseling. So we all went to Vietnam. And many of them had assumptions about what they were going to see. The focus was on looking at disability in Vietnam. So when we had, during those 2 weeks, all those assumptions were tossed. And these students really were transformed. At least that's what they said in their feedback. They were transformed by the experience. Being in Vietnam and meeting people with disabilities who joined us for meals, I invited them to join us and chat each night. We had dinner with different people with disabilities. And that was a fantastic learning experience for students. It opened their eyes to the scope and the dimension of the challenges in Vietnam. Particularly in a country that was devastated by the American War. It was not of their choice. So 2 years ago, I visited Ethiopia as part of Mobility International, USA. It was a tour of the country. And through that work, we are now setting up a university-to-university link. Syracuse with Addis Ababa University. And that with the hope that we can establish an access to justice program, training judges and lawyers. And also in Ethiopia, there was a Norwegian-funded bakery that was run by women with disabilities. It offered them training and opportunities for a job. So, to wrap up, I just have some suggestions that the CRPD enforcement strategy can follow. About international cooperation. So, first, develop relationships with law schools around the world. See, law schools with the clinic, they can focus on international human rights law and work with a focus on disability. Develop the relationships. It's free labor. The law students are there. You don't have to pay them. Let them get to work. Let them do the work. They can do research. They can do interviews. They can get out in the field. And you can call me. Establish linkages between, university to university. And use sociological data and research methods. To develop the data that helps to make your arguments, either in the legal arena and context or in policy context. And finally, use the CRPD to make the argument that austerity cuts that impact disproportionately on people with disabilities is a violation of the convention. In fact, in today's newspaper, the Irish Times, there was an article about the economic, social, and cultural rights, the UNESCR committee. They found that Ireland was in violation of that particular convention, the economic, social, cultural. And the reason is because the austerity measures that was done back in 2008, when the financial crisis hit. So Ireland implemented a series of measures that impacted disproportionately on people with disabilities. So guess what? Ireland has been found in violation. But I wonder, maybe you can make the same argument for the convention to fight against funding cuts that hurt people with disabilities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. I'm going to invite Maria back down for this Q&A session. So now we'll open it up to you on the floor, and if I could have some volunteers to use the mic so that we can make sure anyone with a question can get the mic.
Is there another volunteers in? Do you want to?
Okay, great. So just raise your hand if you have a question, we'll get a mic to you. While you're thinking of your question, two quick plugs. Since Michael mentioned the importance of working with law schools and disability rights clinics, I want to mention our colleague Anna Erskine-Kerslake, who's hiding up there at the back somewhere, who has started a disability human rights clinic at Melbourne University, and we also have a disability law clinic here in Galway. So we would certainly be interested in working with people who have international projects that they feel that we can contribute to in some way. So, question, great, here.
Hi, my question is for Aidan and Maria, or anyone who might have input on it, is when you come across a human rights violation in terms of social protection, and you mentioned that a lot of violations are happening to women and girls within the home or to people that are close to them, but you're working in contexts where a lot of the social protection mechanisms within the state are very weak or even non-existent. How would you go about kind of addressing that and using the law to uphold those individuals' rights?
We'll take a few questions at a time and then come back to the panel. So there's a question in the middle here. Maria, isn't it? Did you like this?
Hi, I guess my question goes off the back of what Michael was talking about in relation to using the CRPD to combat austerity measures. As you will probably have heard about bedroom tax in the UK, and actually in the case of MA, the judge found that they couldn't really, he couldn't really draw on the CRPD, and so didn't utilise that to full effect. So I wonder if you can maybe give any ideas of I suppose more purposive things that could be done in order to get them to look at that again and make sure that we're using the CRPD in the UK as a tool to prevent these measures having such a negative impact on citizens with disabilities.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for the really interesting morning to everyone speaking here. My question goes to Mary, and you were talking about the opportunities to build back better, and you were emphasizing this point. And I was wondering about people that are institutionalized. So, first of all, what happens to them during the crisis and during cases of emergency? And then, do you have any experience with what happens when the people come back from in the in the recovery process, particularly people with intellectual or so-called psychosocial disabilities who are institutionalized.
We'll pause there and go back to the panel, and then I'll take the next round of questions. So if Aidan or Maria could use this mic, and then Mary, you're already on, so you're fine. You want to start?
Thanks very much. It's a really good question. I think the law is only one response to child protection violations. As Michael said, you know, the disconnect between law and the culture is huge, particularly where there are very traditionally held, entrenched customary beliefs. So certainly from my perspective, it's trying to find a balance between strengthening awareness-raising mechanisms, strengthening existing structures, such as community-based child protection structures. So there are many really good quality community-based child protection structures in place. So I think it's important to make sure that they are representative of the host of child rights issues, but representative of the multiplicity of duty bearers that have a role in ensuring that the rights of children are protected. So making sure that parents, caregivers, teachers, the local judicial representatives are on that, local municipal representatives are on those community-based child protection mechanisms. I think making sure that the awareness around legal processes is important. In certain cases, I know in Zambia and Malawi, for example, there have been national monitoring units for child rights being established, and very successfully. So they've worked with caseworkers to ensure a very strong link with the community-based child protection mechanisms. So to ensure that cases of discrimination and violation can be brought to the national monitoring units. And then that the cases can be processed and supported by caseworkers. Now that's obviously resource intense, but it's been one very positive response, particularly in East Africa. So. Maria.
I think the question about the protection mechanism, I think the other thing, I think you're right, there are often national structures in place, and we have to work with those. I think that's a given. It could be family support units within police service. It does really depend. In countries where there's sort of a UN mission, there's also the UN recourse mechanism, so such as the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, and so you can also follow the protection structures through the UN system. But it is, I think, an area where there's a lot of strengthening. I think it's safe to say, an area where there's a lot of strengthening that still needs to be done. And it sort of leads to the other question, I think, about people in institutions. And probably somewhat luckily, I was having this conversation with Alberto, I'm looking desperately around for him. Because this is a bit of a grey area, I think, about people in institutions, because obviously, you know, it depends, of course, what sort of institutions we're talking about. Are we talking about mental health institutions, for example, or are we talking about residential institutions where there's, you know, people have been effectively put in an institution and remain there? So I think it does depend. And it does speak to that issue around the contradictions about what mental health legislation says. And I'm being a bit cautious, because I'm not sure the UK is one of the best countries for this, but about what mental health legislation says about capacity and what the UN Convention says about capacity. There are many, many, many stories in many, many different countries about people in institutions who are often amongst the most badly affected. And I think I'm not going to belabor that point. You can imagine the conditions in many countries in mental health institutions and other residential institutions are not particularly good. There were some WHO guidelines. People here who are better informed about this, to my knowledge, I think they date back to 1997. And they were WHO guidelines around people in institutions, and that included prisons. And it was around mental health and other sort of legal capacities, health-related capacities. Some time after we finished the SEER standards, we did contact the WHO to find out if there was any possibility about those guidance notes and the sort of advice being updated. I haven't heard yet whether it is. And I think, of course, it speaks to a real challenge for the disability and human rights community, because on the one hand, we don't want people to be in institutions. But on the other hand, in many of the countries, that is still a reality, and how to begin and start those processes of deinstitutionalisation when there's very little other support structure. So I think it is an issue that needs a lot more work, and I don't have an immediate solution, but there is a lot of work being done around this, but it's still got a long way to go. So you keep proposing Mary, I don't know if you want to say anything.
Yeah, do you want to add?
Well, I suppose in terms of your question around my understanding is that in terms of crisis situation as well, for people with mental health impairments or intellectual impairments, I think it comes back to, I suppose, making sure that the funding that is supporting, so whether that's through the UN agencies or bilateral agencies or through also mainstream development organisations, that there's a consciousness around I suppose this area, because it's not. I don't think anybody has particular easy answers for it. I don't think it needs to be dealt with, and we need to look at it from the human rights perspective. So I think it's about creating the awareness around use the word vulnerability, particularly of certain groups of disabled people in terms of emergencies, and particularly people who if the institution, which as Maria has said, is somewhere that has been the reality, and if that's destroyed, what happens then, in terms of, is this an opportunity through, kind of better build back, that you're able to go and look at, restructuring within the community and use that as a good opportunity to do that, and that might be a way to look at that, so that, the build better back, I don't know whether I ever say that right, but I always
Build back better.
That it looks at those aspects, so that it's looking at kind of the specific issues that are impacting certain people with disabilities, particularly people who are coming from residential. I mean, from a human rights perspective, when you're looking at from Article 32, you're looking at, funding really shouldn't be going into building institutions. So if we're looking at better build back or whatever it is, we're making sure that that's not going to rebuild or be, so we're making sure that human rights are being adhered to and conventions being adhered to. But whether in practice that happens is another story. I don't know if John heard maybe from anybody else expert around that from international human rights law.
Can I go to Michael's question first, maybe, and then we'll come back? So, Michael, you were asked about the bedroom tax and austerity measures in the UK and ways to challenge that.
Yes. The UK has an independent mechanism in place. In Northern Ireland, it's the Equality Commission and the Human Rights Commission. So I'm sure in England there's something similar to that. So it would call for cross collaboration. Sorry, say that one more time. So we call for cross collaboration. So if you can get a group together of different disability organizations, that they can petition that independent mechanism. You may be able to make a convention argument in that regard. But it's important to have that coalition, the cross-section of disability community organizations in England. So is that all over the UK that you're referring to?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Mike?
I think the issue was that the lawyers in this particular case about bedroom tax, with regard to, very briefly, for those who don't know, bedroom tax is actually a charge on people's benefits for having an additional room that's not occupied, and this is particularly problematic where people with disabilities need an additional room, maybe because they have a carer that's sick occasionally or whatever. But in this particular case called MA, it was a couple who actually had both got disabilities and had to sleep in separate bedrooms. And so they said that the bedroom tax, as it's known colloquially, was actually discriminatory towards them because they didn't in fact sleep in the same bedroom. But the judge to simplify it very, very briefly, said that the CRPD couldn't be used unless this particular statute in question was ambiguous on a particular point. So I guess the issue I'm raising is the UK have ratified the CRPD. People and lawyers are trying to use it within cases, but they're not having very much truck with the judges. So it's kind of a question about what can we do, because these measures are going through, these austerity measures are going through, like the bedroom tax, and the CRPD is not really creating any traction. So that's, I guess, the broader question that I'm asking in the specific example is with something like the bedroom tax.
Well, my suggestion would be to take it to the US, the UN committee. UN committee on United Nations Disability Committee. How's the interpreter?
Taking it, we can
So take it up then, and see if they'll take it,
and look into it.
and look into it.
Okay.
Good luck.
Okay, I know we had some more questions. Our colleague from Sierra Leone, there's 2 questions here, so we'll take those, and then I think we'll go back to the panel to answer them that way in the final round.
Thank you for that. There's a question and a comment. So I think the question is one from Maria. She mentioned about cost, and then for Mary on the use of the UNCPRD. I think there's an issue about a lot of these things, as Maria said, which impacts on cost. A lot of the times when you want to implement these things, people do come back on cost. But I think this is where the comment is. What we found in the past is really to put these things in the context of society. And what my experience in the UK was that when they were doing the buses, lowering the buses and all the trains, they were not really, specifically they were initially thinking about people with disabilities, and now it's benefiting everybody. So it benefits people who, mothers with pushchairs and elderly people and all of that sort of thing. So that's the way we tend to use it. But really it is a difficult one, and there are lots of issues. How do you persuade people who hold the budget over these things on cost? Maybe Maria can shed some light on that. And the other thing is really about the UNCHPRD, the domesticating. In Sierra Leone, we've fought really hard to get the Sierra Leone government to sign up to this. And yet, we're seeing new buildings going up, and there's no sort of thinking about the accessibility issues and that sort of thing. And yet we have a domesticated law as part of the UN Convention. Well, how do we actually go about challenging people who are continually sort of violating these things? And I think Dr. Swartz sort of can come in on that as well. How do we really go around persuading people over these issues?
Here, this question here. Guys, the mic is. Can you pass that mic in? So, yeah. So, thank you.
Hello, my name is Lucas. I'm from Germany. I'm writing my PhD thesis on social security systems in sub-Saharan Africa, and I'm also working for an NGO which has a special focus on disability issues. So a couple of years ago, we built a school of the deaf in Senegal. So we're just working in Senegal, and at the moment I'm trying to implement a project where we want to build a secondary school for around 800 children. So, and I just applied at the German government for this project, and actually I think there can be some problems for us, to get the money for the funding. So I would like that you could say something about this perhaps. So because the problem is in Germany, if you try to get the funding, you're just allowed to apply with typical costs. So it's also about economic things here. So, and in the German government, there's like no experience about inclusive cost, or how much a school could cost. So I'm pretty sure you know that I will have trouble with them to get this inclusive school done. So, you know, perhaps you've got some ideas for a tool or which, I could put into this application further or whatever, you know, so what do we have to include or who do we have to include in such a project? And I've got also another question, so if we're talking about Article 32, I think there could be also a small problem with a progressive realization of social rights, for example. So, there's a little conflict I see, so perhaps you could say something about this.
Hello again, my name is Madalina Cuza. I'm from the European Center for the Rights of Children with Disability, a Romanian NGO dedicated to protect the children with disabilities in our country. I have one question, and I think it's addressed both to Mr. Schwartz and Mr. Aidan Levy. I'd like to know if, from your experience, if you have had any research on or any program oriented on desegregation in education for children with disabilities. Currently, we are trying to implement in Romania at national level, and we are lobbying and advocating for this, to desegregate the system of education, because all of our children with disabilities, either if they have a mild disability or a severe one, they are locked in special schools with very poor quality education, basically no education. There are only places to keep the children there while parents are at work. So each time when we come with this program of creating inclusive schools, the argument, the main central argument of the government, of course, is the money. But if we have a look of the budgets of the special schools in Romania, you will be very, they are very, very big. The millions of euros for one school, for every school, special school in Romania. So my question is resuming, do you have any researches about the cost of inclusion, the cost of making inclusive schools, of creating this kind of schools?
I know there are more questions, but I think in the interest of time, I'm just going to go back to the panel, and those of you who haven't had the chance to ask your question can hopefully talk to one of our speakers during the lunch break. So over to you, who'd like to go first? Do you want to go?
I can do it in order. I suppose just to try and answer all of the questions, they're all big questions, so I'm going to do it shortly. In terms of accessibility, I think that's an important point. In Ireland, I was just thinking when you asked the question, because we still have that issue in terms of buildings being built inaccessible. And I think it's something that it's not. I don't know in terms of groundswell, you need to make sure that law has a certain part to play in it, and I know that in Ireland we have different mechanisms where we make accessibility happen. But also a lot of it came through education, and it's exactly what Michael has said in terms of changing cultures. So, over the years in Ireland, and using Ireland as an example because that's the one I know most, the culture has changed around accessibility. And I think a lot of the times with the convention, and I think Jared always used to say it as well, in terms of expecting it to be a silver bullet, it's not going to change things overnight. So there's a whole process of reform, and we spoke about it yesterday in terms of legal and policy reform that has to happen, so that when it is being domesticated into national laws, that those laws are making sure that there is some type of a penalty or enforcement for not building accessible buildings. I think from an international cooperation perspective, I know through my own research when, working or going to my research with USAID, looking at how they were making sure accessibility was a key issue, but still there was issues when we're building accessible. So I think it's about building that culture. Your question around social, maybe we can have a chat about that face to face in terms of progressive realisation of social rights, because At the end of the day, the CRPD is to be implemented by the states that have ratified it. International cooperation has an aspect to play in that, but equally it's the state's responsibility. And that was one of the big debates around this convention. I can't answer if it's TTIZ or GIZ, but I think one of the things we need to think about, and I raised it around disability specific, is if we're looking at building schools, why aren't we asking big sector investment projects in schools to be reasonably accommodating for persons with disabilities rather than building separate schools? And I think that's a discussion that we all need to have with ourselves, and we need to think about how, because it does come to cost. And if you're talking about building a school that can have all students, well then why are you building a separate school at an additional cost? Why can't you use it to ensure that that school is inclusive? So that's just my viewpoint. So I think that's just did I answer everything?
It's an inclusive school,
Okay.
so it's a normal, regular secondary school.
Okay, well then we need to make them aware of their obligations. Germany has ratified the convention.
Yeah, on the point of education and Germany, I know from our own experience with BMZ and the federal bilateral agency in Germany, they've been, I suppose, showing very promising signs of doing greater work and inclusion with a disability strategy in place. They have the disability sector initiative in place. So gladly, if you want to connect afterwards, and I can put you in touch with our colleagues in Plan Germany, because one of the initiatives that we found, which also is linked to the issue of disaggregation of data, we got support from the German government for a significant education project, which has a very strong inclusive education component in northern Guinea, in the area which recently unfortunately was tortured by Ebola, the area of Faramah and Kisadugu in the north. We found that through a piece of research that we did, which had a very clear focus on ensuring we found out more information about the difference on access to education for girls and boys. We found that 1 in 50 girls under the age of 10 had access to primary education, which is 1 in 50. That's unimaginable in Europe. So we made sure that not just was there accessible infrastructures, but the focus on quality education, ensuring a really strong long-term approach on ensuring that teachers were properly trained, that pedagogical approaches were integrated in school learning programs, but also looking at school governance. And I think school governance is an enormous issue when it comes to accessibility and accessing the right to education, ensuring that the parents, school teachers and children themselves are involved in school governance planning, essentially. But we'd be glad to connect. And in terms of disaggregation, I think there's a couple of examples where even with poor statistical systems in many of the countries that we're operating in, there is examples such as the one that I just mentioned in Guinea, which does help you plan for programs, particularly with regard to education and child protection.
Yeah, I just wanted to address the question that you were dealing with. Now, I don't know about specific research on that, but there is a person in Rochester, New York, at the Rochester Institute of Technology. And her name is Joan Natural, with an E at the end, so it's Naturale. She's actually a librarian in the Rochester Institute of Technology. She would be an amazing contact for you in terms of researching very specific issues on costs of building and making accessible buildings and structures under the guidelines of the Disability Act.
I don't do anything briefly. Just give you a warning. One quick thing about the buildings that are not accessible. I think it's what I was trying to say earlier. If donors are funding these buildings, and they're funding a lot of things in Sierra Leone, let's be honest, then it's also a point that the donors could hold people who are building the buildings accountable. It's not only about the national structures, it's also about the donors being accountable and putting a point in their, in their calls that it has to be an accessible building. And I know this is something that DFID are working towards. So that's one area where we might be able to pursue. Also more awareness about universal design. This is something that's still not, freely and broadly available. A little bit, just to come back about the education, I think this could be a sort of a long and big debate, and you might want to carry it on over lunch. There are a number of areas. One is costing inclusive education is actually very difficult because children with disabilities, the budget tends to, in many countries, it sits with the Ministry of Social Welfare, but the education budget sits with the Ministry of Education. So trying to work out how you cost the child that's going to a mainstream school that is a child with disabilities becomes very difficult. And the budgets for children in school are very limited, very small in many of the countries we work in. So trying to cost that is incredibly difficult because costs anyway are not realistic for the children already in the school. So that's one area. Another gap, I think, is that it's back to this issue of evidence base. I did some work for DFAT, actually, the Australian government, some years ago now, a systematic review on inclusive education. And again, most of the evidence that is there about the effectiveness of inclusive education comes from middle and higher income countries. There's still a very big gap in the lower income countries. So with all the caveats we talked about this morning about putting children into under-resourced schools, etc., etc., I think that's still a big area of gapping knowledge. And that then comes back to the, if we have little idea about what works, it's very difficult to cost it. So I think that if you really want to have a big research project, that could be doing an economic cost-benefit analysis. I hate that term, but it's a big area that's it's going to come back to the same questions, I think. Is that quick enough?
Yep. Thank you. So I'm conscious of our time and not delaying lunch any longer. So I'd like to join me in thanking our speakers for this session. I think it's and I'd like to aim to be back at 2:05. Okay, so see you then.